is up, Shadowverse gamers? So this is Sparta, if you don't already know. I have been on the All-in-One Gaming Generation channel for quite some time now, and I'm going to be featuring a video of doing the tier list for Shadowverse Evolved for sets 14 and 15 here. So if you don't already know me from my original channel, I highly do suggest you do check out my original channel where I do the breakdowns of different decks and deck logs and stuff like that. That of course, just checking out the channel will just give you all the information that you need. But outside of that here, we are going to be talking about the tier list for sets 14 and 15 here today. So let's go ahead and get into that. All right, so of course, we're going to be breaking down the decks in this code. So S is going to be tier 1, A is going to be tier 2, B is going to be tier 3, and then C is going to be the decks that I don't really even know how they're going to perform, or, you know, decks that really just don't have enough support. But most of those cards that we're going to be seeing in set 14 and 15 here aren't really going to have that problem, just because most of these decks already have been running, and I'm only going to be talking about the decks that are getting a lot of support for 14 and 15. All right, so let's go ahead and start with our first deck. So I'm sorry if you can't see the images too well, but I will try my best to break down these decks as best as I can. So we have Marwyn, so Omen of Riposte. So this deck didn't really have any legs when it first came out. I do like how it's been getting like support like every now and then. So I do believe this deck does kind of like belong in B tier, like tier 3. I do think it's pretty playable, but I know in the upcoming like future, it's probably not going to be super competitive. Like the thing about Haven is that you need to be like super cracked in every matchup, and how the meta is just kind of running right now. You need to like play low to the ground, and when you do get into those big guys, you are just kind of like always playing a card that just generates a lot of value and just can swing in for damage and really threaten some like game plans. And I believe Omen kind of doesn't want to do that, or just Haven in general doesn't really want to do that, just because it's going to be playing control. You need to get to the late game. Of course, you're probably going to be healing and banishing your opponent's followers, which is good for getting rid of last words and stuff like that. But I just believe this deck isn't just the way to go when it comes to sets 14 and 15. All right, but next up, we do have the Festive deck. And I'm going to be honest with you, the Festive decks don't really feel all too like, they feel a little lackluster. And I'm sorry I'm taking a pause there, but I do feel like these decks are lackluster. So, and when it comes to Haven, you know, you got to get to the late game anyways, because you have lots of removals and options like that. So I'm going to put it in C tier, because I don't think, like, I don't want to hate on the Haven players, because they did have their time to shine before, and I do believe there are a couple Haven decks, like the Majuro deck that was doing pretty good for Uma. Like, you know, it had its spotlight there. But I think moving on into sets 14 and 15, these decks aren't going to be like top tier, tier 1, tier 2. They're just kind of going to be the decks that do have the support that can get it to run, and it'll be fun to really learn how to play the game playing these decks. And then when you get into like more of a competitor side, which we do encourage on this channel, then, you know, that's not the direction we're probably going to go for. All right, so moving on into the next deck, though, we are going to talk about Yokai Abyss. So this one's kind of hard. So Yokai Abyss has tools to give lots of other followers Storm, and I think Yokai only got like 2 pieces of support here, so I don't want to put it in tier 2. Like if I could put like I really don't want to do the 0.5 thing that I've done in the past. But I'm going to put Yokai in 3. I'm going to put Yokai in tier 3. This deck is... It has the support to be very nice, and we have options now to make the Yokai followers having Storm, or excuse me, the one-tailed foxes having Storm, which is nice, and you do have some good removal and good draw. And I think anyone who knows like the whole entire meta can probably like squeeze into like top 64, I would say. But this is a deck that kind of needs a lot of its tribal members to really work. And a lot of things that Abyss does is really going to be working like with departed stuff. Like you're going to be resurrecting things from the cemetery. And that's kind of not really what Yokai does. And I know it's going to be like an entirely different deck. I know that. But at the same time, you know, we really want to get the most out of our value with our Abysscraft cards. So most of the time we are going to be looping cards, like we play a card and there's a card that gets a card out of the cemetery. So you can play that card again to get a lot of things happening. So I'm basically talking about Departed Abyss, which I do believe is still kind of like tier 1, tier 2. So that's kind of like the guideline I'm thinking about for Abysscraft decks. All right, so let's move on into the next deck though. So we have Handless Abyss. So, all right, the thing about Handless Abyss is that it has its goods and its bads. So I do think it's good because it's very unique to Abysscraft that you don't really have a hand, and you're kind of playing, I wouldn't say on a bit of turbo, just because you're discarding your hand a whole bunch and you're putting cards into your EX area, or you're playing cards through discarding. You have access to those cards from your EX area, but the EX area is just kind of like a common knowledge thing. So of course you're putting cards from the top of your deck into your EX area, but that really shows your opponent what options that you do have. And when you keep discarding cards from your hand, of course, you are going to be getting value off of those cards you do discard, or, you know, Necrocharge and whatnot. But like I said, you're not going to really be surprising your opponent. And then there's those options when you do kind of like start top decking. And those cards really do affect your play points because you need to have 0 cards in your hand. And unless you're playing a card that does discard a card on your fanfare, then it's going to be kind of weird. So you have to make sure you either play the card that you're drawing per turn, like right away. And, you know, sometimes there might be a card that costs 4 that you don't really want to commit to when you have like a whole board of EX area that you don't want to go for, or excuse me, go for in the same turn. So I probably took a giant crap on this deck, like talking about it like that, but I do feel like the deck does have legs, but mind you, you are getting rid of your resources at the same time. And I don't want to put a whole bunch of decks in tier 3, but of course, like not every deck can survive. So, I mean, I'd give it like a solid tier 2. I mean, realistically, I do want to give it tier 3. I think, you know what, I'm gonna stick with tier 3. I think this deck is tier 3. Tier 3. It definitely has the options and like viability to be in tier 2, but I think with maybe later down the line, because Handless Abyss just got here, so I believe later down the line this deck might definitely have more legs and stuff like that. I do like the heal mechanic that this deck does have, though. Most of the cards you are going to be playing is just going to burn face and then heals you for whatever. So I'm gonna lock it in at tier 3. All right, so man, oh man, look at that. So we have Lust. All right, so let's talk about Lust here. Lust is truly it's something. So we did get Sanguine Necklace, which is a pretty good card, I'd say, which if you're going to be going in on a huge turn with Velnarique, I'd say you're setting up for a huge turn. But when we set up for a huge turn and have like 7, like, mind you, you do have to have less than 7 defense, and that means you got to play math. Like, you got to play math. So I think the smart Lust player is definitely going to try and close out the game as fast as possible because, you know, your Velnarique's going to have Storm. You're going to be swinging for 5 on the Evolve. And of course, you know, you're able to actually have some removal now with the token. So this deck does have options. The deck does have options, but mind you, you are playing Sanguine and you are kind of like pinging yourself, and not every card is going to heal you back. So I think in the general terms of Shadowverse Evolve, like I said, I do want to put these decks in tier 3, but I think in terms of like sets 14 and 15, I will say Lust is like definitely doing better than like Yokai, just because there are a lot of cards that ping in Abysscraft, so you definitely have options for different things. So I'm going to put Lust in tier 2. Alrighty, next up we have the Festive Abyss. So, gonna be honest with you, I did talk about this deck today, and I really don't know what this deck does. I still don't know what this deck really does. So I'm gonna put it into like tier 4 or C tier, because like I don't want to say it's like in Handless Abyss, because we do have Handless Abyss here, but like Festive Abysscraft, I read the cards, and I personally feel like that deck still doesn't have enough support, so I'm gonna put it in tier 4. All right, so moving on into the next section though, so we're gonna have Festive Dragon. So here's the thing about dragon decks is that Kagero will do everything that dragon just needs to do a whole lot better. Now, outside of it ramping, that's like the only downside that Kagero doesn't have, is that it doesn't have ramp, which, you know, thankfully it doesn't, because that deck does run off turbo. So really the deck that you need to be comparing any dragon deck to is Kagero. So is it better than Kagero? Of course, Festive Dragon isn't better than Kagero. Now, is it better than any of these other decks? That's the thing. So I don't want to put it in tier 4 just because this deck has the options to ramp, just because we can still run Dragon Oracle and get into this turn 5 where we can play out our amulet and start having the spring counters on it. Putting it in, it feels like there's going to be a lot of decks in tier 3, just because a lot of decks that are going to be in tiers 1 and 2 are just kind of like already like solidified in the meta, and they just kind of do what these decks want to do a lot faster, like Aggro Uma. Agruma is going to be playing low to the ground, is going to be filling up the board. You have to answer their board every time because they're going to be spamming out their board. So like, you know, if can the deck really answer a low body? And that's why a lot of these decks are going to be in like tier 3, I'd say, just because they're not going to be able to match that deck's freak. So I'm going to put Festive Dragon in tier 3 as well. I mean, I really want to put, it's not tier 2. It's definitely not tier 2. It's not tier 2. So, and I don't want to like throw the deck away by putting it in tier 4. So I think I'm going to put it in tier 3. I think like a lot of these decks might sit in tier 3, and I might be a little biased when we start getting into the rune section. But of course, when we get into the rune section, we're definitely going to be dissecting a whole bunch of these decks. All right, but moving on into Disdain. So all of the Galmu players out there, I'm not going to lie to you. I think this deck has legs. It has legs, and it's pretty nice. It does run. Runs pretty good. Just pinging your followers does really, like, with this new Galmu effect, pinging her is kind of worth just because you're going to be filling up the board pretty nicely, and then you do get that nice token card into your EX area to give her Storm. So I'm gonna put Galmu in tier 2. I'm gonna put Disdain in tier 2. And reason why I'm putting it in tier 2 is there are options that you can potentially, there are a lot of Disdain cards out there, and you can definitely remix how you want it to. So Disdain, it has options. It had options. You have cards that now are able to ping and also let you look at the top card of your deck, versus the cards that were just like, hey, you know, you ping a follower on your field, and that was it. So now there's more options for the deck. So I do believe, like, if you do run into those cards, the deck definitely probably feels like 1.5. But it still has that option where you are pinging your own followers and you're not really gaining that defense back. So when it cracks back into your opponent's turn, it's like, okay, well, your 5/5 just turned into a 5/3 because you pinged it twice. And mind you, you did get a whole bunch of effects from that follower, but it still has 3 defense. And I bet you there's a card in my hand that can deal 3 damage to that follower. All right, so let's get into Runecraft. So first we have Kuon. So everyone knows Kuon is going to solidify itself yet again. Tier 1 Kuon it's always been a thing. Like, Spell Chain has been Runecraft's like identity, and every time Kuon is able to be played in a meta, Kuon dominates. So the only thing that Kuon loses to is itself. Just because anytime you play a card, Kuon has an answer for it. Like, it has a spell that's going to either deal it 5 damage, hard remove it, or even if you play 2 bodies, the rune player is definitely going to have the answer to definitely take care of your board. So Kuon is definitely going to be in tier 1. Oh, and then we have my favorite omen. We have Lashena. And man, oh man, I'm glad that this deck got some support. But God almighty, are we making it tribal? And when we do make it tribal, the deck starts to get clunky. The deck starts to get clunky. So I like what Lashena does. Healing 2 and dealing 2 is amazing. You know, my favorite part when playing Lashena is when you get to high 5 your opponent's life total, and you kind of just swap and you're now in the lead. But there's that thing that I was talking about these other decks, like especially for Havencraft, it's one of those control decks where you have to make sure you see the right thing at the right time. And if your opponent's just sitting on gas all the time, like Agruma, for instance, if the deck is just sitting on gas and you don't have removal like every turn, you're just kind of in a weird position. Now, I will say Lashena is in a better position now than it was like maybe like before we got all the support for the 0-cost spell cards. So I can't give it tier 2. I can't give it. It hurts me to put her in tier 3, but in regards to just like how we're talking about this video, I will be putting her in tier 3 just because these support cards are nice. Don't get me wrong. They are very, very nice. I like how we now have a goblin. We now have access to looking at the top 4 cards and stuff like that, but I just don't believe this deck has the legs that it needs. All right, but moving on into Rayo/mages. So another one of the things that I will say is very clunky, but the thing about mages is it digs a lot. It digs a lot, and you have access to Merlin. Merlin is a mage too. So I'm going to give it tier 2. I'm going to give it tier 2 just because the smart rune player is going to top with mages. We have access to playing mages multiple times in one turn, and then with Edict of Truth, we now have a reason to run 7-cost Rayo, so we're able to deal 9 damage to a follower, and this big Rayo can be played for a lot cheaper. So I think I think mages can definitely sit in a solid tier 2. Like I said, the smart rune player is going to know how to remove the board, right? But it's kind of like the same instance like in Kuan. Like mages kind of lose it to itself in a way, like where you're probably not drawing the top 4 cards when you need to, or you're not drawing the right cards. So it kind of loses to itself, but it's one of those decks that you can get under because they're still kind of trying to like set up their game plan. So when I really look at this tier list, honestly, I'm just thinking of aggro, because whenever aggro is being able to play, it's played and it dominates. So can this deck do well against aggro? That's my biggest concern. And of course, like there's going to be tons of mage cards that are able to remove and stuff like that, but there's only so many mage cards you can get to for removal before you start getting into those followers that are looking at the top 3 that aren't really doing something in that same turn. And we even got a better legendary and stuff like that. But I do believe that this deck can be got under, or I think that's how you say it. This deck definitely, you can definitely get under this deck, especially if they don't have that turn with that good removal. All right, so moving on into Festive Sword. So I remember that I talked about Armor of the Stars being banned, and a lovely subscriber did definitely tell me that the card was not going to get banned until March. So this Festive Sword is definitely going to be sticking around, and I'm pretty sure Festive Sword is going to be more of like a mid-rangey type of thing. It's not going to be super aggro like we're looking and comparing to Uma. But I think this deck is tier 2. I think it's tier 2, because once you solidify Jokai and have him as Armor of the Stars, the rest of your Festive Sword followers are going to have Storm. So as long as you're able to make this like stick onto the field, and you're able to get it to have Storm, because you can get into that very big turn very easily, especially with mid-range Sword, because you know Sword has lots of things for removal and stuff like that now. So I think this deck can sit at a solid tier 2. All right, so let us talk about Thief/Loot Sword. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this here. Any card that can give any card on your field Storm while also burning you is just huge. So I know once you get to those 10 cards in your opponent's cemetery, which is very, very easy in Thief Sword. That is like the easiest thing that deck can do, especially with those quick spells that's able to make you, I'm pretty sure, mill 2 on their turn. So if you hold up 1, and of course you do get that -1, but honestly, like you're doing it on their turn, so you just can go ahead and get your hand back and start, you know, playing in tempo with milling. This deck just has so much support, and I think it's just going to be tier 1. And especially that Gilded Blade card, like as soon as you have those 10 cards in Cemetery, any card that you're going to be playing, you can give it Storm, and that is just nasty. I think that is just nasty, getting any card Storm at any point in time. All right, so moving on into Forestcraft though. So this next one is going to be Fairy Forest. I think every set fairies just get support, and the philosophy that I always follow is if they keep printing support, it'll eventually be good. And I think Fairy has I think Fairy just got another 6-cost card that can go very well with Cynthia. So I'll definitely, and you have access to an extra Amataz, and you've already done Amataz already. So being able to put fairies back into your EX area, which I believe is one of the cards that you got in this set for sets 14 and 15. And then also on top of that, you're able to just loop Amataz, which is amazing itself, just because Amataz is going to give those Fairy Storm. And buffing them up like an extra time, those Fairy Whiffs are going to get very nasty. And then when you get into your Cynthia turn, it's going to be even nastier, because those followers are going to get even bigger. All right, next up we have Hostage Hunter, or just Hunters in general. So Azudia, I believe, was a nice playable card. I think this deck definitely... Do I put it in tier 3? Like, I've never seen Hunter have success, but this deck still has access to Sekka, you feel me? So, like, sorry if I got a little... like, I think this deck just... it's hard to place Hunters, just because is this Hunters without Sekka, or is this Hunters with Sekka? So if you're playing Sekka, then you're going to be playing a little bit lower to the ground, playing a lot of more followers that have Storm, and when you get into that mid range, you're going to be looking for followers that's going to be able to swing in for big damage. And then of course with the Azudia that you are going to be rocking, you're going to be taking care of a follower, and then you're going to try and just like burn your opponent for the rest of their life. But at the same time, is it a deck that needs to sit in tier 3? I believe, you know what, we'll stick with tier 3. We'll see what the results look like by the time this set comes out, and then that weekend. Can't tell you exactly how Hunters is going to do. I know Sekka made Hunters playable, And there were some like Shamu Shama are like hunter cards that you can play, and especially with the combo and being able to deal damage. So I think with Sekka, maybe like it goes up here, but if you're rocking a straight Azudia where you're going to try and burn your opponent and you're just kind of like holding them hostage, I do think like, you know, this is going to be a tier 3 deck. All right, and lastly, we do have the Festive Hunter Forest. So this is another deck where I just feel like nothing. Set 14 had all the cards for festive cards, right? But it just feels like these decks don't do anything. And don't get me wrong, I believe Hunter Festive was the deck that had the card that was able to play anything 8 or less from your deck for free, which is nice. I do believe that is nice, but I don't think you're really doing anything in that deck. So I think I'm just going to put it in tier 4 and call it like that. All right, and everybody, here is the list. I think this is pretty solid. Now, I am beating myself up personally just for Lashena being down here, but I'm gonna try my best to cook with Lashena. Just getting 3 idolatry cards is probably going to be pretty hard, especially if your opponent's going to be playing something like Uma. And I know for some of these decks I did compare that some of these cards need to be in terms of like grading for sets 14 and 15 versus like having to go up against the meta like aggro Uma, which these decks are probably just going to have access to just because they have access to removal, they have access to storm. These decks have access to everything, so I do believe that these decks are going to be very strong and dominating for sets 14 and 15. But all right, everyone, thank you so much for watching. I do want to encourage all of you, if you did tune into the video, to come to our Sunday webcam locals. We gather every Sunday at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We have a blast. I think last week we had 9 people show up, so would love to play many more rounds of Shadowverse Evolve with everybody, just because I know everybody doesn't have access to a locals. So why not plug up your webcam and use the cards that you spent money on to come play with us, and potentially, you know, play for prizing when you do come and pay. So highly do encourage that, and you know, if you don't want to, that is okay too. I love you all, and make sure you read your Bible verse and make sure you stay blessed. Bye.